Hello, my creative friends. Today, we're looking at paper. Cold press versus hot press paper. What's the difference? Well, the answer is texture or tooth. Cold press has a texture or a roughness to the paper, whereas hot press doesn't. It's pretty much smooth. If you just came here looking for that answer, then I'm glad I could help. Have a wonderful day. But of course, if you're a paper person or you want to know more, then stick around. We're going to take a closer look at some paper, talk about how you as an artist may want to use both these types of paper, and finally, the big question, which one is better? In my hands, I have two seemingly similar pieces of paper. They are both watercolor paper, 300 GSM from the same brand and virtually the same paper, except for one very big difference. One is cold pressed and the other is hot pressed. The names hot and cold press have a pretty simple explanation. It comes from the manufacturing process. Both are made by sheets of cellulose pulp being pressed through rollers. Cold press passes through felt covered metal rollers at, you guessed it, a cold temperature, whereas the hot press paper goes through heated, smooth metal rollers. There's not really a huge amount of difference when we look at them like this, but when we get close up, that's when things start to change. This is our cold press paper, and when you get this close, you can see what I mean by that texture or tooth. For those that don't know, tooth means texture. Tooth and texture are slightly different, but close enough to be interchangeable for our purposes today. The more tooth a paper has, the rougher it feels, so the more texture. If we think of each little ridge of the paper looking like a tiny tooth, the name tooth makes more sense. With the cold press, when you run your fingers over it, you can feel those teeth. It feels rough, not sandpaper rough, but definitely a raised roughness on the paper. The little bumps and troughs cover the entirety of the paper. If we go even closer and look at the paper, you can actually see the bumpy texture on this a bit better. The felt on the rollers and the drying process gives the cold press paper an organic texture with noticeable highs and lows. When we look at cold press side on, you can sort of see it, but I think I need something a bit better than my cheap microscope to get right in there. We can see a few strands of the cellulose still waving in the breeze from the manufacturing process though. Now compare that to our hot press paper. Immediately you can see that it's a very different look. It's a much smoother paper than the cold press. It's pretty uniform, and when I run my finger along it, it feels just like any normal paper, albeit thicker as it's 300 GSM. Even if we go to our microscope, while there are some very small divots in the paper, it's a much more uniform and consistent piece of paper. So two different types of paper. One is rough, the other isn't. But why? Why would you want to use one over the other? Let's do a little bit of painting and have a look at how both of these papers look and the difference in how they perform. What I'm doing today is a really easy way that you can see the difference between cold and hot press paper. On my left, I have the cold press paper, and on my right, I have the hot. We're going to look and see how the paint reacts on both of these papers and find out what the difference is with cold and hot press paper. To start with, let's just load my brush up with blue paint and do a long, dense stroke on our cold press paper. As the brush runs along, we can immediately see that the paint is going down onto the paper and can see how it's flowing with the grooves and the divots in that paper. Basically, because we're using a water-based medium, the paint is following with the texture and tooth of the paper in its own organic way. I've done it rougher than I would have on an art piece, but you can see the edges of the stroke here are fairly rough and random and a little bit jagged. Now, if we do the same thing on the hot press paper and grab our loaded brush and do a big wide stroke, you can see that there is much less resistance on the paper. We're getting a much more even line and the edges are a lot more crisp. We can already see that the pigment has formed in clumps with the water a little bit. If we compare that to the cold pressed paper, it's a very different look. Let's try another shape now and mix some red paint up. I'll start with our cold press again. If I lay down our paint in a circular motion, creating, dare I say, a circle, you can see the pigment catching and holding onto those tiny indents in the paper. Because of the texture, it makes the paint go down in a fairly uniform way. The texture holds that pigment and blends it a bit. You definitely can see the texture coming through the paint here, but that looks intentional. I'm adding more paint here for two reasons. One, cold press paper is more absorbent than hot press, so that means we have slightly less time to work with the paint. That, and it's very hot here in Australia right now, so everything is drying super fast. I need wet paint to show you this next part. Let's just use a really light wash here and gently touch our cold press circle, and there you go. The paint is blooming out from our main paint block and following the lines of the cold press's texture. It's a very cool effect and a good example of blooms on cold press paper. Right, onto our hot press paper. If I lay the paint down in a circular motion on our hot press, we can already see the harder edge that it's given us. But you can see in the little dots there how the pigment is clumping together on the hot press. It's fairly easy to see denser and lighter sections here as the water and pigment sticks to itself. Now, if we do a light wash and let it bloom, there we go, it's coming out in a bit of a gradient as the texture from the paper isn't there to block and adjust the water flow. If we just let them do their own thing, you can really start to see the difference both papers have. They will dry slightly differently, but it's very much a personal preference for which one you like. But for me, I like what the cold press paper is doing here, and it looks more like what I'd consider to be that organic watercolor look. Let's add a third shape now, just for the fun of it, with a different color. I'm going to use a green and just add a bit of a squiggle and see how the paint on each of the papers responds. Laying that down on the cold press paper, it's really going down very similar to our blue stripe. We can see the edges are that same type of roughness, but there really is no surprises here with this. The texture is coming through nicely. If we look at our hot press, the paint goes down very smoothly and it's much easier for me to change direction on the brush as there's not as much grip from the paper. The edges look to be much sharper and crisper. But here I can already see where the pigment is pooling to itself. Okay, so that's our painting. Let's just speed ahead and make sure everything's dry and see what we end up with. Comparing our cold press stroke to our hot press stroke, overall we have an obvious textured look versus a smoother look. We can see here on the cold press the paper's tooth coming through and it's pretty uniform. The edges of the cold press are a little jagged and you can see that there's almost an outline of the paint here as the pigment has flowed to the edge and been stopped by the texture. With our hot press, we can see it has much smoother edges and an overall cleaner look. There is a small pooling of pigment right here at the top, which is pretty common for hot press paper, but for a hot press stroke, it's pretty good. It has gradiented fairly nicely here at the end as well, as there is less texture on the paper to stop that water flow. Now, with our circle on the hot press, we can see the darker and lighter areas where the paint has pooled and clumped to itself. It does have a fairly crisp border, but you'll notice with our blooms, they're a little dodgy, but you can see how softly the pigment has gradiented out. Again, that's pretty much because there is less friction on the page. The cold press circle is fairly uniform and the texture coming through makes that a bit more consistent as it's got a pattern which makes it all look fairly similar. I have poured on the paint a little much in the top here and that has bloomed into the circle when it's dried, which is interesting, but our other blooms really show off that traditional watercolor effect. They have almost got a border around them where the pigment has flowed to the edge of our water and been stopped by that paper texture of the paper. They also haven't gradiented as softly as the hot press, and it's basically a much denser color. Our little swirls are interesting. On the cold press paper, we can see that texture isn't quite as dominant as the stroke because the brush has changed directions as I swirled it. It sort of masked that texture a little bit. There is that slight border around the entirety of it where the paint has flowed to and been stopped. Again, it has a slight roughness to the edge. The hot press swirl looks like it was done as an afterthought because it's pretty terrible. But you can see here really well where the water has pooled and the pigment clumped to itself in the bottom. But where the areas haven't clumped, the edge is much sharper and the gradient in it is much more subtle than the cold press. One of the things you might have noticed with the cold press paper is that the colors are less rich and slightly darker when using that paper. This is due to the way that the light reflects off the paper. The indentations on the bumpy surface of the cold press paper scatter reflected light, thus producing the darker colors. For such similar paper, you can really see the difference is in the detail. Paint behaves quite differently on both, but that doesn't answer our question as to why you would use one over the other. So why use one paper over the other? Well, overall, cold press paper is probably the most popular type of watercolor paper, used for a couple of reasons. It's generally relatively easy to use, suits almost any style of watercolor painting, and is usually a bit cheaper. Cold press paper has that texture and that character, which when you're using it, you aim to incorporate into your design and painting process. When we use cold press, we can expect the water and the pigment from your brush to flow through the nooks and crannies and give you that organic look we saw before. With cold press paper, the aim is not to fight this. Instead, you plan and adapt for that randomness. But if you want something possibly a little bit less organic, maybe hot press paper is what you're looking for. With hot press, the paper is smoother and the paint and pigment falls on the paper in a much more predictable manner. Because of the higher density of the paper fibers, hot press paper is also less absorbent, which gives you more time to play with the paint before it dries. We've also seen that the colors are more vibrant and saturated on the hot press because less of the color is absorbed by the paper. Hot press has less of an organic feel and a different character when you paint on it. So for a lot of people, that's the exact reason they would use hot press paper. As a rule of thumb, it's easier to do more precise detail and far more controlled work on the hot press paper. That's also why hot press is often easier to incorporate pencil and ink into your work with. Now the big question of the day, which is better? That question is actually really clickbaity because the answer is quite honestly, neither. Hot and cold press paper are both perfect tools for very specific jobs, and if you know what effect and look you want, you'll find yourself jumping between both of them in your art projects. I do that pretty much daily. For me, I use a lot of the cold press for a lot of my kids' book illustrations because that organic watercolor flow works extremely well for that style. But I'm finding more and more lately I have been using the hot press on my artworks because while I love the organic flow of the watercolor on the cold press, I'm incorporating more and more mixed media. The precision and the control of the hot press and the fact that I can pretty much use any medium smoothly and easily on this paper is a real boon. But that's just me. For you at home, my strong recommendation is to try both. Just squiggle with watercolor on cold press and hot press, try incorporating pencils and textures or ink and see what you like. The more you experiment and the more you play, the easier it will be for you to pick a paper for your next project. Well, that is it for today. I hope you all enjoyed this little change from the reviews we've been doing lately. I'd love to hear your thoughts on hot versus cold press paper in the comments below. Also, do you want to see more of this sort of stuff or should I just stick to reviewing pencils? Let me know. Speaking of reviews, I will be back next week with a very exciting pencil to review, the very modern, very sleek Winsor & Newton Studio Collection pencils. In the meantime, if you'd like to see more of my work, there are a ton of links in the description of this video, or come say hi and hang out as I'm on Twitch most days. That's it, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Happy painting.